Today I'm speaking with Aaron Tomlinson. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, Tim, thanks. It's great to be here with you, man.
Great to be with you. And I have heard about you for a while, but I don't know too much about all of your journey. So I'm looking forward so much to hearing it today. But we're just going to get to know Aaron together. And I'm just going to start with a quick bio, and then we'll jump in. Aaron was born and raised and still lives in Colorado, which I'm very jealous of. He went to Adams State University there, also in Colorado. He was a charismatic Christian his whole life and even a pastor from 2002 through 2020. And he's a licensed clinical mental health counselor now. He's been married for 30 years. Congratulations. That is so cool. And they have 2 teenage boys and 3 dogs. And he co-hosts a podcast with the legend of legends, Derek Day himself. It's called Freeology Friday. I'll let you guess which day of the week it is. No, it's every Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, and it's on YouTube and Facebook. I'll have the links beneath this video. Please go like and subscribe and check out their great work. And I just want to also mention that Aaron is not landing the same place as I have with my worldview. This is something that I've come back to a couple times on the channel. I wanted to say that we love being able to say not everyone's deconstruction needs to be the same. People can land different ways. Some people end up with an afterlife. Some people don't. Some people end up with a sense of a higher being. Some people don't. There's no right and wrong. We're not looking to create a new religion with where we've landed with our atheism. We're just looking to hear people's stories. And I know that Aaron has some absolutely amazing things to say, and we'll talk through that today. But with that in mind, Aaron, if you could tell us more about yourself, and then also share any hobbies or fun, quirky things.
Sure. I could keep you the whole time probably sharing quirky things. I don't know about fun things, but quirky things for sure. So
Nice.
I live in southern Colorado. I live in a town called Pueblo, which is just a little bit south of Colorado Springs. I've lived here my whole life, which is crazy. I guess Pueblo is kind of known as people in Colorado call it the armpit of Colorado, which is interesting. I remember seeing a meme from the movie The Lion King where it's got the picture of Simba and gosh, it's been so long. Whatever his dad's name is, they're looking over at the elephant graveyard, and his son asks, "Dad, what is that?" And it says, "Son, that's Pueblo. We never go there." So, but
Nice.
anyway, all my family's from here. My wife is from here. I've got 2 children. One's going to be 15 in June. The other one is 13. And I've got 3 dogs, bearded dragon, fish,
Nice.
and
Partridge in a pear tree.
yeah. And having been from the mountains when we were talking before we jumped on, you talked about how you like this part of the country and stuff. I love it as well. But if I had my preferences, I'd probably be by the beach, sitting on the beach. So we are going to Mexico next week to do that. So I'm looking forward to that. So, but
That's
anyway,
awesome.
thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited too. And I'm excited too because this is one of those cases where I don't really know your journey almost
Sure.
at all. I've seen your face come up on Facebook like 1,000 times because of my friendship with Derek Day. And
Mhm.
I was, by the way, able to interview Derek a long time ago, far too long ago. I need to have him back soon.
Mhm.
So that will hopefully make that happen. But I'll have the link for that for anyone that wants to check out Derek Day in addition to your Freeology Friday links.
Sure.
But I feel like this is going to be interesting because I feel like every time that I hear of someone that's in the deconstructing community, but they've landed somewhere different, I'm like, I want to hear about it because I feel like one of the interesting parts about the journey is that often it seems like we've kind of come to a conclusion. This is you study comparative mythology, you study the psychopathic nature of Yahweh in the Old Testament, you study canonicity, and you're like, okay, I'm making a firm conclusion. This is all bullshit, and I'm done with it. And
Mhm.
when someone comes along and says, well, I'm going to shake things up a little bit. Let's look at it from some different angles. It's like, okay, this is helpful because even though I'm not sure, it feels a little uncomfortable to say you might be seeing it from a new perspective. It's actually like great to be challenged and to say, just because you've landed somewhere doesn't mean there's not some really better perspectives to this. So I'm looking forward to hearing your story. But if you could, before you get into anything too controversial, if you could just tell us, a little bit about your journey. How did you get exposed to Jesus and Christianity, and also about the pastorate?
So I grew up in a rural area. My father was a very successful businessman in the area. And I wasn't raised in a fundamentalist background. I was raised, pretty typically white. We went to a Methodist church and, said grace, but I didn't get, Bible thumped or didn't really even know anything about the Bible. And then when I was 16 years old, everything came crashing down around us. My dad, uh, at the end of the day, it's complicated, but he had a business failure. But he had a business failure that landed him in jail. And because it was the 80s and it was the farming community, that did not bode well for us because the perception was my dad was later acquitted, but the perception was that he had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from the local farmers. So we lost everything. So all of that to say, I went through an extremely traumatic time when I was 16, 17 years old. And I guess rather than sitting there and saying, where is God in all of this? It was the only resource at the time that I felt like I had to lean into. So I leaned into that. I went to a mountain town to go to college the following year. And it just seemed like everybody that I ran into was a Christian, which was shocking to me. I really planned on going off to college and doing what college students do, which was party and sleep around and whatever else. And by October, I find myself being drugged by my friends to an Assembly of God church and to I don't know if any of your viewers will remember Petra, or if you remember Petra,
Oh, yeah.
the Christian band, and they were touring with Josh McDowell at the time.
Yep.
And
I actually went to one of those. Was it about the why wait? Like why wait
Yep.
to have sex? Yeah. That
Yep.
I went to one of those concerts. Very, very influential in my life.
Yeah. So, whatever we want to think about Josh McDowell now that we know a little bit more, I didn't know much at 17, but he's very persuasive. He's very convincing. And so I ended up radically giving my life to Jesus and got what we would have called back then radically saved. So, yeah.
There's no other way, right?
Yeah. So I switched. Oh, I was very sincere. So I switched from whatever I was going to do at college, and I ended up going to a Bible college that was local. It was one of these church Bible colleges. It was accredited, but not regionally accredited. You know how I'm assuming, how that goes.
Absolutely.
And, but I was, I was radical, man. I would go out on the streets and evangelize. I worked at a clothing store. I would joke around that I'm witness to the mannequins, trying to get them saved. And I know now that I was really trying to just cope with trauma and pain, and I was kind of running away from that. Christianity provided me a really good, what you might call a spiritual bypass for having to deal with all of the situations that I was confronted with that was overwhelming me at the time. But I did end up leading several of my friends to the Lord, probably about 30 young people, and I wasn't going to church. So I thought, well, I need to take them to church. So we just walk into this church where, it was probably a dying church, meaning it didn't have a lot of young people. There was maybe two people, that were younger than 30 in the congregation. And one Sunday morning, they got 30 young people that just walk in. And wow. So I got promoted into all kinds of ministries. One thing led to another. And I ended up starting a church in our hometown in 2002. And so then from there, I did all kinds of short-term mission work, spoken lots of leadership conferences. I did a lot of stuff, man. And during that time, all that pain, all that trauma, everything was still there because I didn't know how to process it. And so Christianity was really easy for me, especially the brand or version or tradition that I was in, because we really emphasized a lot of, who you are in Christ, and Paul's writings. And so, my favorite Bible verse was, if anybody's in Christ, he's a new creation. Old things have passed away. All things have become new. So it really just gave me a psychological way to stuff everything that I didn't want to deal with.
How long, just for the timeline, how long was your dad in prison, even though it was eventually acquitted?
Yeah, he didn't go to prison. He did go to jail for 90 days. He did get sentenced to paying restitution. But the main thing was we had just lost everything. So we were, upper middle class, I would say. I lived in a small town, about 500 people, definitely probably one of, if not the wealthiest family in the town. And then literally almost overnight, they lost everything. The bank accounts were seized, business was closed. They took the house. My parents were ordered to get out of the house in 7 days. So this whole process of him, going through sort of an appeals process and all this stuff, it probably took 3 or 4 years.
Wow. Then as a kid, even a teenager, that would be incredibly traumatic. And wow, that's rough.
It was a whole community rejection because, like I said, it was a farming community, and my dad was perceived as, having stolen from all of the farmers. And like I said, it's very, very complicated. A lot of it had to do with the commodity markets back then and what was going on. So, yeah, it wasn't fun.
In terms of the trauma, was there other traumas besides that you felt like the church, your time at the church was sort of helping you to assuage and to ignore?
No, I think that was pretty much it. It was very difficult. So when my parents had to move out of their home that they'd lived in for 20 years in 7 days, we literally ended up practically begging on the street. We were able to get my mom called it the tin can. We were able to get a trailer house, but it was full of rats and cockroaches, and then having to go to school my entire senior year, having to work. I worked 3 jobs to help my parents pay just basic bills and stuff like that. So I think it was just the tremendous shock of going from one particular status, especially in high school, to feeling like and kind of being treated like the scum of the earth. So no, I can't point to anything else that was horribly traumatic for me. That was enough.
Yeah. Mm. And in terms of your exposure to Christianity, did you feel like the Assemblies of God and that whole more charismatic movement, did that feel like it was a continuation or just a natural progression from what you'd already seen in Methodism? Or did it feel like this was a whole new different world to you?
It was a totally different world. And I only went to the Assembly of God church for like 3 or 4 months. And then I couldn't, I didn't like it anymore. But yeah, I mean, in the Methodist church, it's not quite liturgical, but it's pretty formal. We still do like responsive readings, and we sing out of the Wesleyan hymn book. If the pastor talked more than 20 minutes, the board members were going to, call him up and tell him, hey, we need to be out by noon on the dot, Whereas when I went to the Assembly of God church, everybody's hugging each other and calling each other, brother and sister. But it was very, obviously very fundamentalist. I remember one of my friends challenged me on I think the issue of speaking in tongues. And he said, Aaron, you either got to take all of the Bible or don't take any of the Bible. And I wish I would have listened to that on the other way. But I decided to take all of it. So I did my best for, let's see, I was 18 at the time until I was 45. I did my best to try to follow the Bible, believe the Bible. And yeah, here I am today on your podcast. So.
How did you and your wife meet?
We met in church. So she was one of the 2 people under the age of 30 that her and her brother, I think, at the church that I started to attend. And she was going to a Quaker Bible school at the time in Kansas. And so, yeah.
That's a little different.
Yeah, very different. So we got married at 23, and she has endured until the end so far.
Would it be correct to say that your marriage was founded on your relationship with each other, but also with Christ and with your desire to do missions and ministry?
Yeah, without question. Absolutely. And, unfortunately, we did end up getting involved in really fundamentalist circles. So we bought into the Christian model of the family too. And so, yeah, she did her best to be the submissive, obedient wife. And I did my best to, be the Lord of the home or whatever, however that's supposed to work. Didn't work for us. We kind of chucked it at some point. We just didn't tell people. So yeah, but she wanted to go on the mission field, and I felt like I may eventually end up going on the mission field full time. And of course that never happened for us, but yeah, that was definitely part of what brought us together for sure.
Yeah, I would say for me too, like when I was at that age, anybody that was like really serious about their walk with the Lord, like you weren't just looking to say, is that person like physically attractive to me? Or did they catch my eye? You're like, is this a good ministry partner? And and of course, if you're at that stage in life, when you think that way, if you've got God as the center, if he's everything, then you're basically saying it isn't even like there's no other option. We used to describe it as like, if God is like here and you're like a spoke of the wheel and he's like, you're aiming towards the center and someone else is aiming towards the center, then it isn't even like you're focused on each other. You're focused on God, but just happen to be focused on them together. And they used to say too, look around. If you're in a race and like there's going to be people passing you, and you're going to be people you're passing, but look for someone that's in a race toward God who's at the same pace as you, and and that was like the ministry pitch. But
Yeah, you're taking me back, man. I remember hearing that, and being taught that before we got married in premarital counseling and all that stuff. Exactly the same illustration. I'd forgotten about that.
well, hopefully it's not bringing up trauma.
No, I'm fine.
In terms of your pastorate, like what got you? Because that's a big
Mhm.
big deal. What had you kind of envisioned that long term, or was it out of the blue, or how'd that work out?
No, I never envisioned it long term. So this group that I sort of, went to the Lord and started in my late teens, early 20s, most of those people stayed local. It's one of the things that's weird or interesting about Pueblo is that a lot of us do stay here. And so it just kind of eventually organically grew into a congregation until we decided to officially start something. We tried some other churches kind of as collectively as a group, but those weren't pleasant experiences. And so eventually they're like, Aaron, you've been leading us this whole time anyway. It makes sense for you to start a church or for us to start a church. So we did, and it took off, almost immediately took off. We won several community awards. We were voted, I think, best place of worship by the community for 3 years in a row or something before we shut down. So it was very organic.
It's weird to hear that. Does that, when you got that vote, did that strike you as weird? Because I was always like, the world outside should be offended by you. They should not like applaud for this. Like, if you're not offending everybody with the gospel, which is a stumbling block to the unbelievers, for them to vote for you is weird. But anyway, I know what you mean. But
yeah, no, we weren't quite. We didn't quite have that much of an adversarial view, I guess. But I understand where you're coming from because I certainly heard that over the years. You're kind of taking me back, Tim, because a lot of that, BS that I forgot about.
that was my background, was but much more the fundamentalist, good, the old time gospel hour kind of stuff, and I went to Bob Jones for a year, if that clarifies things at all. But we're in the world but not of the world, and we're definitely wanting to be around them only enough to save them, but not let them influence us. And certainly that the gospel should offend them until Christ opens their hearts, the Spirit opens their hearts, and makes them bow their knee to the reality that Christ is the Savior. But otherwise, their sin in them should say, "Oh, I don't want to bow my knee. I want my pride to be on the throne." That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But in terms of the actual initiation to your being a pastor, did that feel like a good fit? Did you enjoy it?
Nope. No, it was not a good fit at all.
Like ever?
No. I enjoy. I do enjoy teaching. I enjoy learning, and so preparing for messages or whatever, I was always kind of digging in and studying and trying to look at things from a different perspective. So those aspects of it I enjoyed. I was terrible at counseling. The reason that I'm a counselor today is because I was so bad at it that I decided I needed to go get some training. So I ended up going back to school when I was 34, I think, and got a degree in psychology and then a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. But I wasn't even comfortable telling people I was a pastor. So it wasn't like this, I know there are some circles where it's really a big deal and, to be the pastor and all of that stuff. That definitely was not me. I would get on a plane to go someplace and I got to where I would cringe because I knew the person next to me was going to ask me what I did for a living. And I did not want to tell them I was a pastor. And so I got to where I was just telling people I was a motivational speaker, to be honest with you. Just to bypass the uncomfortable conversations and all that. So I would go to pastors' conferences, I go to pastors' meetings, pastor prayer meetings, and completely feel like a fish out of water, completely feel like a round peg in a square hole. But then, and this is, I think is, an important part of my journey, but God had called me, right? I was called of God. And so I didn't have any choice in the matter. This was just part of, taking up my cross and following Jesus or suffering for him or something. And so that was, as I was going through deconstruction, that was part of what I had to work out in my life as well, because I realized that because I got so radically saved at, 17, 18 years old, that I missed a lot of developmental steps. And so, yeah, that was difficult. And that's been one of the hardest parts of my journey is to realize, I missed out on so much of these developmental steps. And you can't help but sit back and wonder, if things would have been different, if I'd had a different, if I hadn't met so many Christian friends, when I went to the university. what would I be doing today? What would my life be like today? And that can be kind of yeah, that's just something I had to wrestle through and work
It,
through for sure.
it's weird thinking those thoughts because you think too, you probably wouldn't have been attracted to a Christian woman, and she wouldn't have been attracted to you if you were on fire for the Lord. And like to think that would have led to my kids not existing, and it's
Oh
amazing.
yeah, yeah. It's just it's a total. I don't know if I could curse on your.
Yeah, yeah. Feel free.
It's a total mind fuck for sure.
It
Uh,
is.
absolute,
It
absolute.
is. Well, I want to ask you more later in the interview about how your relationship has evolved together with the deconstruction, but I wanted to get into your story first. So, just for before you get into your deconstruction part of it, what
Mhm.
was it specifically that made you feel like unhappy or out of place as a pastor, especially compared to other pastors that you were, able to be in those meetings with? Did you feel like they had something different that they were doing that you couldn't measure up to, or you just weren't interested in it? What was it different? Because the reason I'm asking is, for me, I grew up wanting to be a pastor my whole life,
Mm,
and to me, it was the pinnacle. It was the highest role. Now I think of it as obviously almost criminal.
yeah.
I think of it as like you're basically just a cult leader, and any version of Christianity, you're a cult leader. But growing up, it was the total opposite. It was like this was the best thing ever. So to hear someone say that you were in it and you did it, and obviously for 18 years, you must have had something going well because they kept you for 18 years. For you to not enjoy it is very interesting. So I'm curious, what was it that made you feel out of place?
Oh gosh, all of the above. I don't think I really compared myself in a way that was like I'm not as good or these guys are better. Like I it used to crack me up because I go to these bigger conferences and sit, with the pastors. They usually have special seating or whatever for some pastors. It's so ridiculous to think about it now. And invariably, you'd have these guys asking you, how big is your church or what size is your church? And we never got much above. I suppose if at our largest, if everybody showed up, we had about 400 people. So I got to where I started telling people when they'd say, "How big is your church?" I tell them the square footage in our building.
Nice.
So, in our first building, how big's your church? Oh, it's 12,000. And they'd look at me like, now, what's your name again? Because they'd wonder why they hadn't heard of me and that kind of stuff. And so I found the whole sort of celebrity culture distasteful. I didn't let people call me pastor. I tried really hard with people in the congregation to downplay that role. I still have. I ran into a friend of mine that I've been friends with since kindergarten, honestly, just this weekend, and he still calls me pastor. And even when I was a pastor, I would say, "Don't call me pastor. I don't like that. I'm just Aaron. I'm just a guy." So I think I really struggled with it, Tim, to be honest with you, because I just didn't like the system. I just didn't know what was wrong with it. I intuitively knew that there was something very wrong here and something very wrong with this system, but I couldn't. But it's all we had, and it's in. I was thoroughly indoctrinated in it, and so yeah, I think it was just I was very uncomfortable being in the spotlight, so to speak. I was very uncomfortable with the authority that came with that. I just didn't know how to reconcile that. So, I felt like I had to do this because I thought God was telling me to do this. I wanted to be good at it from the standpoint of I really did get into it because I wanted to help people. And it's one of the reasons I went back and got a counseling degree because I realized I suck at this, right? Like people would come in with all kinds of problems, all kinds of mental and emotional disturbances or really serious marital issues and problems. And they'd look at me and just telling them, well, memorize scripture and prayer and pray to me felt disingenuous, even at the time, almost offensive. And so I was like, I have got to get more equipped to be able to do a better job of this. But I really did not like hanging out with pastors. I didn't have any friends really that were pastors. And I just was uncomfortable the entire time in the role.
Hmm. No, I assume that we could say that you were sort of deconstructing the pastoral position because of what you just said. But when did the deconstructing Christianity start to get tacked on as well?
Yeah, so that depends. That depends on how we define deconstruction, right? Because I got disillusioned with evangelical Christianity in 2000, 2001. So
Before you began to be a pastor?
where I began to be a pastor. So I was, I really got into the Christian mystics and was reading that stuff back in the early 2000s. So I probably didn't read anything about Christianity that was written in the 19th or 20th century for a while. So that's probably another reason I didn't feel like I fit in very well, because we didn't really preach this evangelical message. I don't think I did one single message on hell or eternal conscious torment or anything like that. So I ended up like this progressive Christian. So, I don't know, how familiar you are with what's kind of gets labeled the progressive Christian movement, but
Yeah.
start listening to people like Greg Boyd in Minnesota, Brad Jersak. And so I think it started for me with the whole penal substitution idea, this idea that God had to kill his son in order to be able to forgive us. I started deconstructing from that. I never bought into the rapture stuff, even though everybody around me that was charismatic and Pentecostal at the time, they bought into all the rapture stuff. I think early on I did, maybe for the first year or something. Actually, yeah, when Saddam Hussein first invaded Kuwait, that was supposed to be the end of the world. And then when that didn't happen, I was like, well, that's all bullshit. So I deconstructed from like a penal substitutionary type of atonement. And then probably about 2008, I started getting exposed to Bible scholarship. Before then, I didn't even really know what Bible scholarship was or even really care. So I kind of went through this. I became a universalist for a while. That was real easy, having read a lot of the Christian mystics, to just become a Christian universalist. So there was this sort of gradual deconstruction from contemporary Christianity, but definitely at the time, I didn't leave, faith in God or faith in Jesus.
And the universalism is like the love wins, Rob Bell kind of stuff. God's gonna he's gonna have his church that looks separate from the world now, but eventually he's gonna bring everybody in.
Yeah, correct. Okay. Which is silly when you think about it.
Yeah. And were you threatened by the fact that you were asking some questions that for other Christians or for your earlier version of Christianity would have said, be careful, that's a slippery slope. If you go down that road, like once you pull apart that verse and, maybe the flood wasn't a worldwide flood, maybe it was local, and, maybe Adam and Eve were metaphorical. Like once you start saying that stuff, you're like, well, once you pull a few verses out and kind of make them into a progressive Christian interpretation, you can keep going, and to the point where you say maybe the whole Bible is just a metaphor, and maybe therefore I can just take it or leave it. But it's just like reading Plato or Aesop's fables or something. There might be something good in there, but it's just more of like a philosophy book to glean what you want and leave the rest behind. For a lot of Christians, that's just like no. This is the exclusive Word of God. Were you scared of where that journey was taking you?
I would have to say yes and no. I actually embraced it because I'll be honest, I don't know what really changed in me before I started pastoring, but I had very little affection for what most churches were doing because I wasn't as evangelical as everybody else. Even though I started out very evangelical, going out and witnessing and testifying and all of that stuff, somewhere along the way, I let go of that stuff and it became more about again, the practical issues of being a Christian. So again, I really didn't care like about the flood or whether Jonah got swallowed by a fish. So I guess I never really bought into this, I deconstructed early. Let me say it that way. I deconstructed much earlier from the inerrancy of Scripture or the infallibility of Scripture, even though I wouldn't have realized that I had done that already. So the one issue that I was afraid to examine and afraid to look at was the issue of hell, because I thought, boy, if there is no hell, and this was before I landed in universalism, but I thought, boy, if there is no hell, because there was a certain element of Pascal's wager with me, right? Like, I'm not going to bet my eternal damnation on atheism or whatever the case may be. So we're just not going to look at that issue. Like that doesn't feel like that's in the character and nature of God at the time. That didn't feel like it was in the character and nature of God to send anyone to hell or punish anyone. Yeah. So that was the one where I was like, if I look at hell and decide that hell is all bullshit, that's going to be a game changer for me. So I put that one off. I kicked that can down the road as far as I possibly could.
Just curious, did any of your conservative Christian friends ever attack you and say you're not really a Christian?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I was a cult leader. I was, from the very, very beginning, I was, and because, in the charismatic Pentecostal world, there's definitely belief in demons. And so, yeah, I can't tell you how many pastors, told congregant members that they were following, that I was deceived, that I was an end time deceiver, that I was full of demons. That was pretty consistent for years. So it was very irritating to them when we would win community awards and stuff like that. And I rather enjoyed that part. So I think there was a part of me that always like wanted to give two middle fingers to that. But yeah, I mean, it's complicated. For me, even when I try to sort out like my life and where I'm at and where I was and how things played out, even still for me, it's pretty complicated to get my arms around it. If that makes sense.
Yeah. It's amazing to me, just for a quick aside, it's amazing to me how much of when you deconstruct and deconvert, it's important to focus on the topics that get you there, but it's interesting too to step back from the whole thing and say, now that I've taken this journey, what is all this stuff that I've been through and seen and learned? What does this just say about human nature? What do we tend to do? And it's amazing how we are such a judgmental species, and we love to poison the well and say that's the enemy. And I know it's just tribalism that's just never left us, but I mean, even when you think about like, okay, like I'm a Christian and you're a Muslim, so you're going to hell. No, you are. But then you zoom into just within Christianity, and you're like, we Protestants are going to go to, you're going to go to hell. No, you Catholics are. And then you zoom into Protestantism. I mean, there's subsets of subsets of subsets. And did you ever see the show Cheers?
Oh yeah, of course.
Do you remember that one where Woody is dating that girl? I forget the real rich girl. And at one point they're thinking about getting married, but they're realizing that they have like different religions, and they've realized that they have the same version of Lutheranism, but there's like one church follows the creed of like 1646 and one follows like the creed of 1591, and they're like they're coming to this agreement about like we can work this out, and finally the council that's helping them, I think it was Fraser, is saying something like, which end of the egg do you like open up first, or which end of the egg do you crack? Do you crack the bigger end of the egg or the smaller one? And like they realize that even that is like a big deal to them. Like, oh my gosh, you cracked the egg from that side of it. And it's like there's something in us that wants to fight and fight and fight and vilify everybody. And I feel like that's one of the things that's been a good takeaway for me with deconstructing, is saying, do you see it in yourself that you are going to have a tendency, even though you're probably going to say some true things about some Christians and some pastors that are predators and that are grooming people and that they are telling falsehoods and this is mythology and it's toxic, but you're going to have a tendency in general to vilify someone that's different than you. Be careful, because that vilification is not necessarily the answer. It comes into play if you're careful, and there's tact that can be had with it. But we're also trying. I always like to think to myself, if I vilify somebody and I show you truly are wrong and you're a jackass and you're hurting people, and a year later they are like, you know what, you're right, I was wrong, I'm sorry. I want the issue to be the issue, not that I was the jerk to them. Like the issue should be the topic that we're talking about, not this extreme ad hominem. And it's been an interesting takeaway for me. But anyway,
I love it. I think that's awesome. And yeah, you're right.
When you were deconstructing bringing into your wife to the situation, was she concerned like you're going towards liberal Christianity here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so for my wife, now she was raised in a fundamentalist home. And she did have the Bible kind of beat into her. Not literally. They weren't, that kind of family. I know there's those kinds of families out there, but
yes.
But she always struggled with, I guess some of the basic questions that we all struggle with it when we deconstruct, like the problem of evil. How can a good God allow all this suffering in the world? Or penal substitution never made sense to her. And she really didn't like being a pastor's wife. So I think there were levels of resentment that built up over the years in our marriage. So I think she was relieved when I started deconstructing.
That's interesting to hear. I'm so glad though, because for a lot of people, that's a death knell of their relationship. So,
oh yeah, yeah.
So, could you take us into the actual then, like path? Like, where have you gone with this? Because once you deconstruct hell, and you deconstruct inerrancy, for a lot of people that has some pretty, pardon me saying it, but some logical ramifications that, like, if this is not true and that's not true, therefore X. And you've taken some different interpretations to that. Where has your deconstruction landed you? And do you feel like it's over, or are you still kind of, I mean, I know nothing's over, but do you feel like you've kind of come to a place of equilibrium, or are you still very much questioning things?
Yeah. So let me just share like a part. So right before I turned 45, I just really began to see all of the dysfunction that was in my life. And I had a realization that a lot of what I'd done with religion, major decisions in my life, honestly, probably marrying the person that I did, becoming a pastor, all this stuff, I was still trying to avoid and run away from that pain that I experienced when I was 16 years old. And so I got to 45 and completely burned out. I had nothing left to give. The way I describe it for people is I feel like I'm, look at the cabinets and the cabinets are bare. I don't have anything else to give out. We were very successful in our community church at the time. We ran a lay counseling center where I trained up lay counselors, and we had seen hundreds of people, provided free counseling for our community and stuff like that. But I felt like I had achieved everything that I wanted to achieve, but I felt like I had climbed a ladder and it was leaning against the wrong building, if that makes sense. So we got away from everything for a few months and went to Phoenix, Arizona, and I got into counseling, and I specifically picked a secular counselor. I remember someone asking me, like, are you going to pick a Christian counselor, And I'm like, no, absolutely not. Like, what can they tell me I don't already know, And so I started doing some trauma work. And through the course of this trauma work, I was unpacking what had occurred in my life that had, really knocked me off course when I was 16, 17 years old. And I remember sitting there with my counselor, and this fear, this terror of the wrath of God began to surface as I was doing this work. And she took me through a process where I was able to release that, where I was able to let go of that. And once that happened, then things radically shifted for me. And I remember we're in Phoenix, we're staying in a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home, that we had rented for a few months. And I remember just sitting there for days thinking the very thing that I thought was supposed to help me, the very thing that I thought was supposed to heal me, the very thing that I thought was supposed to be a solution for me was actually the thing that was doing more damage to me. That was actually the thing that was harming me. It was actually the thing that was killing me. And that was astounding to me, honestly. So from at that point, then I became aware of religious trauma, and this was back in 2016. So I don't know, I think religious trauma syndrome's at least somewhat recognized today, although I would argue that in the mental health field, they need to catch up with what that is and how that affects people. But I realized that it's not just the people, people like to say, well, you're just gave up the faith because you really got hurt, or you just don't quite have the right doctrine, or no, there's some really shitty, traumatic, horrible stuff in the Bible. And when you immerse yourself in that, it's going to do really shitty, traumatic stuff to you. And so from my perspective, people not only have to work through the trauma, the sociological trauma, the relational trauma of what happens through rejection and, whatever kind of abuse that people may have suffered in abusive religious systems. But the doctrines itself, the God itself that it props up is very abusive, is very maniacal. And so I think a lot of people who do come from dysfunctional families can find themselves at home in church because the dysfunction that's in church feels like the dysfunction that's in their family. And so for me, I had to work through, I got confronted when I got burnt out with the real issues that I had been postponing dealing with using Christianity as a spiritual bypass. And I had postponed it effectively for 2 decades until finally I just couldn't do it anymore.
That's crazy. It's amazing with the things that can be buried. And it's amazing. I think about religious trauma a lot with what I do and just in my personal life. And it's amazing too how deep some of those roots go, and you think you've healed it and you've dealt with it and you haven't, or there's more, you have dealt with it, but there's more layers to it to still uncover. So when you got to that point where you're dealing with all these things, dealing with religious trauma, you're bumping up against the hardest questions. And when you start deconstructing inerrancy and bibliology, and you start deconstructing, salvation and atonement, that's enough to do a lot of damage in a sense, but that's still very different from saying I'm an atheist or I'm an agnostic. Like, how did you approach how you were going to address those questions, and like, where is that journey taking you? Because for a lot of people, I think they would have said, if none of this is technically from a God for sure, it seems very man-made, and atonement doesn't sound right, but yet the Bible's full of atonement. It's for messaging. Like, what's left of the Bible? And so is it at this point just a philosophy book to you, or do you feel like there is a theistic part of you that still feels like do you, for example, do you pray? Do you talk to God? Like, where are you with it all?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. So from my perspective, I think that one of the things that is interesting to me is that all of our theism in the Western world specifically is so rooted in Abrahamic religions that people cannot think about a God or metaphysical realities outside of the framework of the Bible. So it's almost like there's a binary choice. Either you are a theist, which means you are somewhat beholden somewhere to the Bible, because that's how we know, I guess, I don't know, that God exists or whatever. Or there's no God at all. It's very much an either or, all or nothing way of thinking for me. And so I don't think it has to be that way. I think that we kind of do that to ourselves intellectually and mentally and perhaps even emotionally, because there just aren't other prominent options out there for someone who maybe wants a spiritual life or a spiritual connection, for lack of a better word, to describe that, who maybe thinks that there is something beyond physicalism, something beyond materialism. So for me, I'm an atheist in the sense that I do not feel beholden to any aspect of Abrahamic religions whatsoever, not even necessarily monotheism in that sense. But I also don't have to close the case and say, well, then if this God isn't right and this book isn't right, which I think is very demonstrably true, then materialism and physicalism has to be the nature of reality. And so for me, what I've been doing has been exploring other possibilities and other options. Do I still pray? I don't. I meditate a lot. I have become interested lately in various different philosophical systems and ways of thinking. So, I don't like to label myself innately. I'm not an atheist, in other words, and I realize this is completely subjective. However, a lot that goes on in our life is very subjective. In fact, you could argue that everything that we experience is subjective because we're experiencing it as the observer. Even science begins with an observer, right? And so I just subjectively think there is a God or something like that, although I find the word God to be problematic. So it's hard for me to identify myself, because if I say theist, then people are going to put their understandings and their presuppositions about what it means to believe in God around it and understand me that way. And that would be to misunderstand where I'm at. If I say I'm an atheist, then as a general rule in my experience, both atheists land up in physicalism and scientific materialism, and I'm definitely not that. So it's very difficult for me to come up with a term to describe where I'm at. And I would just say that I'm very, very open at the moment. I cannot imagine any scenario where I would suddenly say, you know what, maybe the Bible was right. And maybe there was a flood, and maybe there is a hell, and maybe Jesus did die for our sins. I can't imagine a scenario where that would occur. But it's definitely not a case closed for me in any way, shape, or form. But I think it's important for me to be open to other options besides the binary choices of I'm either beholden to a God of the Bible or a God of the Abrahamic religions, or there's absolutely no God at all.
Yeah. Have the Eastern religions become part of that journey for you?
No.
No. I was just curious because I've heard several people say that did help them, either Taoism or Buddhism or some version of it. But
No, actually, for me, it's going back to Western philosophical traditions, like Plato and Hermeticism and things like this. Even paganism, to a degree, speaks to me more than, say, an Eastern philosophy would.
well, it's interesting you say that because there's quite a bit of Platonism and Neoplatonism for sure, and Hermeticism that is woven into the New Testament, with especially the Pythagoreanism stuff. And it's fascinating how so many people, like I always chuckle when I come up against someone that's like a fundamentalist Christian. I don't mean chuckle where they can see it. I don't want to patronize them, but I chuckle inside because I feel like there's so many things that when you're a fundamentalist Christian, you don't just think of, that the world works this way and this is my theology and worldview and everyone else is wrong, but you also are just typically very sheltered and very ignorant of other ways. And it's so fascinating to me, like when I hear someone say something like the road to Emmaus, where Jesus was, showing them, the scars. And I think you don't know, do you, that Emmaus was one of the servants in the Homer's Odyssey who recognized, his former master by the scars, right? And when Jesus says to the disciples, "Go to the water pitcher, the man with the water pitcher, he will show you the way to the upper room." Like, you don't know that the Aquarius is the water pitcher, constellation, right? And all kinds of things, going on. Even like you look at the numbers, like Luke, where I think it's the Gospel of Luke, where there's so many numbers, and they talk about that older couple that's waiting for the appearance of the Messiah. And that eventually, Jesus is brought, and they're like, yeah, I've seen the Messiah now I can go die. I've been waiting for this my life. But there's numbers in there, very specific numbers of she was, is this age? You're like, you don't understand. Like, those are Pythagorean numbers. You're not getting it. And it's fascinating to me. And there's other stuff, even just like the parallels of like Dionysius turns water into wine. So Jesus does. He rides into town on a donkey. So Jesus does, yada, yada. But there's so many things, even like the names Zacchaeus and all these things. There's like, you just need a primer. You need like the primer, not of an education, but of the ability to have a scope for the imagination to say, maybe they were doing something different with these texts than we think. And it isn't that the texts are either they're like, this is completely true or it's bullshit. It's that they're doing something different. It's like saying Moana, the movie Moana, it's my mind because the kids love it. I'll be like, Moana is true or it's bullshit. Like, no. It's a movie. They're doing something with it. You can enjoy it and you can have takeaways from it without giving your life and, saying I'm going to bow down to Maui. That you can take parts of it, but you understand the genre of what it's doing. And I feel like for so many people, they just don't get it. Did that become part of deconstructing, is realizing they're copying and they're doing stuff with the text that are kind of secretive?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because that's something that I had kind of even forgotten about. But I did start taking a mythic approach to scripture before while I was still pastoring. So when I would preach oftentimes from a mythic perspective, but myth in the way that maybe I'm sure your audience would know all about. But the average person, they hear myth, they generally think we're using a story in order to tell us about the actual literal physical nature of reality, rather than sort of a parable, sort of a story. Like Pinocchio is one that I always think of. The kind of the moral to the story is about lying, or there's a version where the moral to the story is about not having that good Protestant work ethic. Or so there can be truth that can speak to our hearts, really, about our lives, that has nothing to do with sort of a literal, physical, actual thing, right? And so I do think that there was a whole lot more of that going on in the Bible than people realize or people understand. And so, yeah, in fact, I had when we had a YouTube channel for our church, I had a entire teaching that I did on the mythic nature of the Bible, but not maybe from the standpoint of it's all bullshit because it's a myth, but it's, these stories aren't literally physically true, but there are lessons in there that we can learn and apply to our lives.
Yeah. Does it ever concern you when you do that people that might follow that course of action from a progressive Christian perspective, they might be fine, but that it only takes one generation to get back to fundamentalism, and that the Bible needs to be exposed as a place where people have gone to basically find monstrous ideas and to justify thus their racism or their homophobia or their other monstrous ideas. Like, does it ever bother you that like we're in some ways trying to clean it up and still use it, even though it's been used for so many horrible things over the years?
It's a great question and a really solid point. I would argue that it's still very, very, very much being used in that way. So from my perspective, offering an alternative way of seeing scripture is important because it gives people that option. I tend to think that we do what we do as human beings because of what's inside of us rather than what's happening around us, although I realize there's an interplay to it, obviously. But someone who's going to be an asshole is going to be an asshole whether they're using the Bible or whether they're using scientific text or whatever the case may be. And so I actually think it's really important that alternative views are presented, because at the end of the day, just based on the sheer numbers of it, most people are not prepared to deal with this world is all there is. This life is all there is. It's kind of we're here, we struggle through life, and then it's lights out. Most people aren't going to embrace that. They just aren't, because they're not prepared to. They're not prepared to do that from an existential perspective because of their psychology and because of their emotions and because of all kinds of reasons. So I think it's really, really important. So do I worry about if we emphasize the mythical value of the Bible, say there's value in this story because it can teach us something that we can apply to our lives, then there's a danger that people will take that and they will get into that and become fundamentalists and use that as a horrible, to justify doing horrible things. At the end of the day, people don't need the Bible to justify doing horrible things. They'll find a justification for it anyway. And so from my perspective, and not that I'm doing this, I'm not actively out there saying, hey, let's reinterpret the Bible. I'm not doing that at all. But if that were to occur on a larger scale, I think that would be a very good thing and a very healthy thing for society, because it presents an alternative for people that are going to go that direction anyway. It presents an alternative to literalism and fundamentalism. So that's how I would answer that question.
It's so fascinating. With where you've landed at this point, do you feel like, when you look at things like marriage and kids, there's sort of like these guardrails they're there when you're a Christian, like we're together because God brought us together. We know where we're going for eternity. We've got a mission. We're here to know him, to make him known, to love him, to share his love with the world, to do ministry together and to further the kingdom. And, kids are basically, for lack of a better phrase, they're basically little soldiers for Jesus. Like how does this shift the way you do your relationships with everybody, but especially with your kids? How does this change? Like I could ask it a couple different ways, but like what are the conversations like with your kids about theology and worldview stuff? But also, like, how do you see your purpose? Like, what is your purpose at this point? And what have you, I guess, not that you've found one, that you've created one, obviously, not finding one in the Bible, but like, what is your purpose now? And what makes you get up in the morning and do what you do?
Oh, that's such a great question, Tim. And I'll be honest with you. There have been many days that has been a struggle for me, getting up and doing what I do. I mean, there's been many days that I've woken up and thought, Dad coming, I got to do this again, because that's one of the things that I try to, at least this was my experience in deconstruction. Other people's experience obviously will be different. But for me, it was a whole identity that had to deconstruct, because there was purpose. I'm on the side of God. There is a reason to get out of bed, because you're on a mission from God, and all of that stuff. And so when you let go of all of that, you also have to let go of those aspects of your identity and those aspects of the understanding about your own existence, right? I'll tell you a story with my children. I don't remember. I don't remember why I was doing this. I had a reason. I think I felt it was important. This was a number of years ago. My children were still not old enough to read. So I was reading to them. And for some reason, I decided they needed something in their life that could anchor them through difficult times. Because as bad as it was for me, in the sense that I found so many aspects of my Christian experience to be traumatizing, it did give me an anchor that got me through a difficult time in my youth. And so I was like, they need something, right? And so I was like, open up the Bible, and I'm reading to my kids, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to pick a Bible story here, right? And I turn to, like, I don't know, Cain and Abel. I'm like, I don't want to teach them that because they're two brothers, and these two brothers, killed each other. And then I go to
Jephthah and his daughter.
Yeah. No, I didn't think of that one. Noah's Ark, right? So I'm gonna and we make it like this cute thing. People, decorate their nurseries with all these animals and stuff. It's like, no, this is horrible. This is awful. I don't want to teach this to my kids. I mean, I'm having this experience in real time, And so I'm like, I know, I'll go to the New Testament, and then I start flipping in the New Testament, and somehow I just landed on some of the teachings that Jesus had about faith. Mark chapter 11, if you say to the mountain, be removed and cast into the sea, nothing will be impossible to you, or Matthew 17, wherever that's at. And I thought, well, I don't want to teach him this. He's going to find a dead bird and think he can raise it from the dead. And it was really eye-opening to me. I was like, wow, there really isn't anything in here that I can think of. And I'm a person who probably read the Bible every day of my life for 20 years, studied it, felt like I knew it inside and out. And yet here I am going to teach something to my children, and I'm examining these stories and I'm asking myself the question, is this really something that I want to put inside my kids? Is this really something that I want to teach them? And the answer was no. And so I I went to my bookshelf and pulled Jonathan Livingston Seagull off and started flipping through that. And I was like, okay, this is a good story I want to tell my kids. And I ended up reading that to them. And then I never picked up a Bible again to try to teach a Bible story to my children. And so in terms of how I raise my children, it's, we're trying to give them the freedom to explore and seek, and encouraging them to have an open mind, but also teach them some critical thinking skills. So right now, my 13-year-old is a militant atheist, whereas my 15-year-old, he feels an affinity to some of the teachings of the Bible and to Jesus, and believes in God. And so we're trying to, navigate that path without being fundamentalist one way or the other, to say, no, this is how you have to believe, or this is the best way to believe, and this one's not okay. And so it's interesting to watch the conversations that they'll have back and forth with each other and stuff like that.
I bet.
So yeah,
that's amazing. It's great though that you're giving them that freedom to say, like, this is your journey, this is your life, this is your mind.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's crucially important. And then you asked, like, what gives me purpose when I get up in the morning. So I absolutely love working with people. I love hearing people's stories. I love helping people make sense of their journeys. And so I'm a counselor. I'm a mental health counselor. So I get to work with college age people. I get to work with people that were where I was, that may be struggling with questions about life, or coming out of really difficult family situations, and they're off on their own for the first time. And so being able to work with that population gives me tremendous joy, aside from just raising my kids. And then I would say that primarily, I think the biggest thing that I sacrificed in my Christian experience was my authenticity. So that was one thing when I finally completely deconstructed, that I made probably my highest core value. My top priority was I'm never going to sacrifice myself like that again. So I'm going to try to live as authentically as possible. And so those things, I'm going to be as authentic as I can today. And I have an opportunity to be involved with other people in a way that hopefully is making a positive difference for them in their lives. And I'm raising a family, which is by far the most important thing to me. I worry about the future, obviously, because things have been so crazy in our world. But that's why I get up in the morning.
It's amazing. I love how you're describing that, and it's such a good thing. I say with my kids, that it's important for you to have the power over what you believe, and for other people to not be able to force their worldview on you. And it sounds like you're doing the same thing, which is so cool. I'm just curious, like, how do you see your son that's the militant atheist, and not him, but how do you see militant atheism in general? Do you think that it is misguided? And I'm asking this as if, like, I'm very happy with where I've landed. So I'm not like searching. I don't feel like I'm like in this existential angst where I'm like, you know what, there's got to be more to this life. And I feel like I need to keep poking the bear until I figure out what's wrong. Mm-hmm. I'm happy with it, but I still think it's interesting to hear from other people's perspective. Do you think that the people that are more materialistic and nihilistic are missing anything that you feel like you've come to see as more valuable than a nihilistic perspective?
Yeah, that is a really great question, Tim. Thanks for that question. One of the issues with religion in general is it demands conformity. And this comes out of Aristotelian logic, right? This comes out of something can't be, it's either true or it's false. And as Christians, we were so afraid of like moral relativism or any kind of relativism in the way that we thought about things. And so for me, when I was a Christian, it's like, yeah, Jesus is the only way. Everybody needs this. This is going to benefit and help everybody in their lives. Depending on how we use the term militant atheist, that fundamentalism can also be there. This is the way it is. We know how it is. You don't know how it is. And if you think any way differently than that, then you are just not as educated, or you're not as smart, or whatever the case may be, because the world is going to be better off and everybody's going to be better off if we just shit can the whole thing. And I find both of those to be very fundamentalist approaches. So for me, what's really nice is that I know that we are all very different. We all come from different backgrounds. We all have different experiences. We're all born with different temperaments. We all have different personalities. We all have different value structures and value systems. And so I don't feel a need at all to try to impose any belief system on someone else, or say this belief system's better than that belief system. I mean, obviously, when you're looking at something that is promoting genocide and promoting slavery and promoting misogyny and promoting homophobia, that is a very destructive belief system. But that's systemic. That is a systemic issue. That is not something that one individual can affect or impact. Together, we can certainly make a difference in that. I don't feel the need to convince anybody of anything at all. And I think it's okay for people to have different opinions and viewpoints and beliefs and experiences about the nature of reality, about the meaning of life. So when you do away with there's one God, I mean, the problem isn't just theism as far as I see it. The problem is monotheism. If we were, in a culture that was polytheistic, then you've got your gods, I've got my gods. We believe our way, we do our stuff, you do your stuff, and we can all figure out how to coexist. But when you say there's one God who has revealed truth to us, and we have to figure out, is this the revealed truth? What is the revealed truth of this one God? Well, then when you think you've got it, then you've got the truth. You've got the revealed truth. And so therefore you're right and everybody else is wrong. And I think we can do that in any area of life. We can do that as Democrats or Republicans. We can do that as Christians or atheists. We can do that as on any issue in life, right? Even though obviously Democrats and Republicans aren't saying Well, maybe some Republicans are saying this is the revelation of God for sure. But
Sadly.
that comes out of that monotheistic revealed religion perspective. And so by getting rid of all of that, then um, life really is relative to the person. And I think that they should have the right, as long as they're not taking these same rights away from someone else, they should have the right to experience life the way they choose.
Yeah, agreed. Well said. Can I ask, and I've just got a few final questions and we'll get to a wrap up, but I'm curious about just your internal experience in terms of, like you talked about, you're a mental health counselor. So you see it in other people, but I'm sure you're aware of, different thoughts and changes and emotions in your own heart. Like, what has the peace been like when you were a Christian, say, maybe around the time you started being a pastor? Could you compare that peace to peace you have now? And then also maybe, just compare, just talk about the last couple of years. Like, do you feel like you're happy? Do you feel like you're at a spot of peace where, not the kind of peace that passes all understanding that we used to talk about, but do you just feel like you're at a spot of peace with life, knowing that there are unanswered questions and knowing that we probably aren't going to get the answers that we need, and we are in some ways going to have to just kind of go through our lives knowing that we're at best guessing, but that that there's some sense in which you almost, even as a nihilist, have to kind of pretend that life matters, if you know what I mean. You kind of, like, I'm a nihilist. I don't think it matters, and I think someday we'll all be gone and we'll all be dust, and no one will remember us, and then it will never have mattered. But for today, it matters. It matters to me. It matters to my kids. But it's, you have to find some reason to get out of bed in the morning, to be joyful, to find, that meaning and purpose, even though it's in some ways manufactured and artificial. But there's a real strong sense even throughout that process where you have to ask yourself, in a just a utilitarian sense, is this making me happy? Am I happier? Am I better off now than I was before or not? And I know my answer, but I'm curious what yours would be. Like, what has it been like, and just how is the journey going now? Are you happy?
Yeah, so I'm gonna talk about the journey. When I mentioned earlier how I worked with that counselor and resolved some of that trauma about the wrath of God and all that kind of stuff, and then I'm sitting around back then thinking, wow, what I thought was the solution really turned out to be the problem. And what was so interesting to me, we put emphasis on the fruit of the Spirit, right, from Galatians chapter 5: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, all that good stuff. And what I found was that that was my natural state of being. It wasn't something that I had to strive to be. And when I let go of this, striving to please God, striving to be obedient to God, worried about this overseer in the sky that's watching my sexual fantasies, or every time I would get angry or something, I just discovered that for me, even though I was working through trauma, even though I was in counseling, that what I had been trying to achieve was, again, just naturally occurring for me in my life. And so so you ask about today. Now, let me throw this in. And then it wasn't. So then I've had some bad days, right? And I definitely did have some days where I went through that sort of existential uh, depression, is what I would call it. I would call it an existential depression. What is the purpose of all this? What if, when it's all just completely meaningless and we'll be dead and nobody will remember us, and we, obviously our consciousness will be completely gone. And so I went through that as well. So I don't want to give any kind of impression that, I just chuck Christianity and boy, it's just all been uh, unicorns and rainbows and a bed of roses since then, because that's certainly not the case. Um, but as of today, one of the things that I think has helped me is I can be a very analytical person, in the same way that people can escape life through religion. They can also escape life through analysis. And what I mean by that is, instead of living life, they're thinking about life. And they spend most of that time thinking about life rather than experiencing life. And in order to experience life, we have to be fully embodied. And that means that we have to sometimes get out of our head and really, really, really allow ourselves to become present to what's going on in our feeling and emotional body. And as I do that, I'm discovering that I remember watching my children. Let me use this to explain it. When I was watching my children when they were growing up, because they were two brothers close in age, I remember one time watching them, they would be laughing, and then the next minute they would be fighting, and then the next minute they would be calling each other names, and then the next minute they would be crying, and then the next minute they would be laughing again and okay. And it struck me how easily they just allow life to happen. They allow life to, and their emotions and their feelings to flow through them. And so I've endeavored to model myself after watching my children and saying, okay, I'm going to be present to my life. I'm going to be present in my body. I'm not going to spend so much time in this, what some people call the paralysis of analysis, right? And that has allowed me to not just be happy, not just be peaceful, but to have all of the experiences that we have in life without judging my emotional life or well-being as being better than, or this is good and this is bad. So I'm able to show up for all of life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And for the most part, my abiding state would be one of peace and enjoyment.
Do you ever have Christians come try to get you back?
That's an interesting question, because I was really public about this. I was making posts on Facebook. I was doing Facebook Lives and things like this. And I don't believe I got a single phone call. I don't think I've ever had a single person that has approached me and said, hey, brother, we're worried about where you're at, or we're worried about your soul, or I honestly cannot think of a single person that has tried to leave the 99 and go after the one, as Jesus said, in my case, which I think is very telling. So, yeah, the answer to that question is no, but I'm not sure that that's a good thing.
It is so interesting, that dynamic. I've had people respond like what you said, and other ways, to where you do get the sense that some people are like, to hell with them. If he wants to leave, then go enjoy hell. And they're just really very brazen and very, harsh about it. And other people are like, I really feel sad, but you've been hurt by the church. Obviously somebody really hurt you, and you can't get past it. And it's really a shame that you can't. I hope you get counseling. And, it's like, I had one person say, I hope you find what you're looking for, like as if I'm looking for some hidden key, but you do get the sense too that some people are threatened by it, with like, the scripture probably better than I do. And you left? I mean, you were preaching it, for goodness sake. And you left? You know what's at stake here. Come on. And I think there's almost that sense of terror of like, if someone that knows the scriptures that well can fall, I need to kind of stay away, or just that internal terror of like that if they were to entertain the question of what if he's right? Mm-hmm. What if this book isn't divine? Mm-hmm. If he's right, then there are consequences to that are too terrorizing to imagine. I'm not going to see my, loved ones when I pass in heaven. My life maybe has a different purpose, or no transcendent purpose. Maybe there is no ultimate moral judge with whom we have to do. And life just can kind of get very dark very quickly. And even if they wouldn't necessarily land in nihilism, even if they deconverted, they just, as a Christian, it feels like it's either Christianity or nihilism. Mm-hmm. And the terror of that is too much. And I was very similar. I think I had, maybe it was like a year or 18 months before somebody wrote me a letter. And it was just like the letter you'd expect. Like, yeah, I know what's happened to you, but Jesus is real. He died for you. And I mean, if you really want to question this, there were 500 witnesses to his resurrection. Like, can you name one of them? There's 500 witnesses that they talked about in the book of Acts. And this is not like, we know for sure Jesus is definitely, the living Son of God. And I hope you'll come back and realize it before it's too late. But apart from like that, it was almost non-existent. And it does make you wonder, like, do you really think that I was just like a write off at this point? And you do get that feeling, and just the sense too that people are grieving. They're behind the scenes talking about you, perhaps for a while. Maybe eventually they kind of forget about you, but they're talking at first, and it's really a shame. What a horrible loss to the community, but also like you get that sense of like if you know how in the Old Testament it seems like God with the nation of Israel is kind of saying, look, if you really want to go whore with the other idols and you want to go intermarry with the other peoples, fine, but I'm telling you, I've got a better path for you. Stay faithful to me and I will bless you. And you get this sense almost like God is like grabbing ancient Israel by the collar, like, why are you intent on dying? Like, don't you want life? Don't you want to have life? I can keep you from dying. And it's like eventually he kind of says, I've asked you 1,000 times to come to life. If you really want death that much, if you really want to be the slave of ancient Babylon or Assyria, whatever, if you really want that life, you really want those false idols instead of me, the real God, I've invited you 1,000 times. If that's really the life you want, go have at it. I've done everything I can. And I get the sense that some people are kind of see it. They're like, I've tried. You know better. If you really want to throw your life away for atheism, what else can we do? You have the words of life. They're in your head. And what is that verse in Hebrews? If you reject Christ or whatever, after the knowledge of the truth, there's no more sacrifice for sins. You get that sense that you become kind of. I mean, I never heard anyone tell me that atheism was the unpardonable sin, but it kind of becomes the unpardonable sin. At least if you're a questioning atheist, it's sort of a gray area. But if you're like a solid atheist, it's like you committed it. You're done. You're gonna fry.
Yeah, but only if you believed first. We'll win the other atheists to the Lord, but if you served God all your life, forget about it. But
Yes.
I think you have a great point that there is sort of an intimidation factor. Intimidation is not the right word. I can't remember the word that you used. Where they're afraid. It's like you knew the Bible, you preached the Bible. If you're questioning or you're leaving the faith, I'm afraid to approach you and have a conversation with you because that might be that slippery slope for me too. I think it's a really good point, and an aspect of it that I have not thought about before.
One of the guys that I've interviewed for a couple times, Jonathan M.S. Pierce over in the UK, he uses the word the terror aspect of it. And he thinks a lot of people it's psychological in the sense of like, if anything you're saying is true, then we're on a worldview level, I'm terrorized and I'd rather just shut it down. And I do think it's a driver.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with that.
Well, in terms of just where you are at this point, I'm sure that you see some interesting stuff with the mental health counseling. But in terms of your looking more at your, what you do with Phreology Friday with Derek and these other conversations with people that are willing to talk to you about it, what are you seeing in terms of people's pains in their deconstruction journeys? What are the hot buttons that are just like, that's a real tough topic? Like where are people getting stuck in this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So with those people, I would encourage them to give themselves permission to seek and to give themselves permission to change their mind. I think you can try on different worldviews and different perspectives without making a commitment to those worldviews or those perspectives. And so I never want to invalidate someone's experience ever, because I think that's what religion does. I mean, the whole idea of the resurrection is an invalidation of human experience. You have to believe something that defies everything that you know about death and everything that then ultimately you know about life. And you have to believe this, and it doesn't matter what you've experienced, just believe this. So again, people say, well, God did this or that for me in my life. I never want to come around and say, yeah, but we know intellectually that's all bullshit. So, you need to, that was just, who knows? Because to me, that's the same side of the coin. It's I think people can deconstruct intellectually, but they never deconstruct in their hearts. They still have the same heart that they have to be right and the other person has to be wrong, like you were talking about earlier. And so in that sense, they may have gone all the way intellectually, but they didn't go far enough in looking at their own patterns and how they relate to people and how they treat people. So I think the brain likes closure. We like to know that we don't like to wrestle with questions because it's much better and easier for us if we have the answers. We don't like cognitive dissonance. So I encourage people to embrace that, embrace the process. Be authentic to yourself, just like with my children. One of my sons, like I said, is leaning into Jesus, but that's authentic to his temperament, frankly. And he's not getting into the toxic stuff yet. We'll keep an eye on that, right? And then my other son is very much kind of has this amazing analytical, intellectual mind where he's able to think about these questions, and I want him to be able to do that as well. But I also think it's important to be. It's okay to change your mind. Like try on some beliefs, try on some patterns, try on a way of life, and if you don't like it, make a change.
Hmm. And for anyone it's in that journey where they're finding that they're stuck either because they're depressed or they're really fearful of the backlash from the believing community, especially like the higher control cults. But there's a lot of people that know that they will have hell to pay, literally and metaphorically, if they leave, and a lot of people will hate them, and so they kind of have to maybe keep this on the down low for a while because they know that if they speak up, it's going to be a very very very
Yeah.
huge amount of backlash, and it's going to be devastating in some ways, and maybe even it costs them a job or a marriage or whatever. To someone that's in the darkest part of this, where they're like, I can't go backwards to my old beliefs because I see the issues, that they're real issues, and I can't go back. But I can't say I can go forward either because I'm just stuck. I'm really stuck. For someone that's going through what we're already talking about, but they're in that phase of it's really just dark and depressing. Do you have a word of encouragement you might give them that that it does eventually get better?
Yeah, I think it's okay to go slow too. Like I'm thinking about people, actual situations that those really cultic, like all of their friendships and family are center around a church or center around a belief system. And not everybody has the strength or even should try to break away from that. That doesn't mean that they have to buy into the hive mind, so to speak, or buy into the groupthink of everybody else. But for some people, it's probably just wise to do that internal work and not really tell anybody. Now, that can be very lonely. It's like, I'm going through this, I've got all these questions, and I want to be able to talk to somebody. And that's where I think the online community can be really helpful. Anybody can jump into a private deconstruction group and not necessarily have their whole family see the questions or the interactions of what they're going through and find some community. So that's one of the things that I think is really wonderful about the work that you're doing and that others are doing is it does provide a space where people can ask these questions, where people can think differently than the way that they've thought before. They can be exposed to, like you were talking earlier about the various different philosophical and cultural contents that are in the Bible that they don't know is in the Bible, that can empower them to think differently and empower them to look at life differently. So I would say that for some people, it's just not the best time to come out and say, hey, I'm not a Christian anymore, right? That's a personal choice and part of someone's personal journey. But if they're afraid of letting go and aren't exactly sure how they're going to make sense of their life or find meaning in their life, or exactly, like I said, I dealt with some existential depression for sure. And I think that I would encourage them by saying this is part of the process. This is part of what we go through. And it's okay to embrace that part of the process. You don't know. I think keeping aspects of the unknown and openness to the unknown is super important. And it's okay to be there, and it's okay to have those questions. Try and set those fears aside and really validate your own experience and think through the questions for yourself. So
Good answer. Yeah, that was helpful. Yeah, if I could just add real quick, and then we'll maybe give you a chance to tell us about Freeology Friday here in a second. But one of the metaphors that I think is really helpful, or the comparisons, is how you could look at relationships, human relationships that are abusive or toxic, and compare them to either God or the church. And deconstruction, I think, in many ways is like that. But when you think, if somebody is, let's just say, married to a real abusive narcissist, and they've convinced everybody that they're the best person ever, and you're the spouse that's being beaten up, physically or verbally, whatever. And you just know that you could probably speak up, but if you speak up, you're not really going to be believed because the other person's just so good at manipulating people and tricking people, and people are gullible. And it's a hard journey. It's a really hard journey, and I think one of the hardest parts of it is just saying, in terms of the way when you look at yourself, you have this safety net of like, yeah, but I'm he's a narcissist, but I'm married, I've got a steady home, whatever, and you can't imagine any other life at that moment, and so you kind of put up with the abuse, you kind of put up with the mistreatment for a while, because it's so hard to imagine. I mean, you just think if I leave this abuse, I'm sleeping in my car or something. Like it's a bad situation.
Right.
And probably, if you're really getting a narcissist talking at you, they're going to say, no one's ever going to love you like I have. You're unlovable. And so you're just feeling like there's so many issues and so many pressures and so many wounds that are going to happen if you take any steps. But to have that perspective and even to look at other people that have taken it before you and say, I need to have an imagination far enough in advance to say, number one, I can get safe again. And
Yeah.
number two, I might lose some relationships, and that's heartbreaking. It's not easy. And I've done it. I've gone through it. A lot of people I talk to have gone through it. But to say, just imagine a community around you someday that will wrap their arms around you, and imagine maybe a love relationship someday again where you will be loved and it won't be abusive and toxic. And even though it's hard to see that, it might be a year or 2, 3, 4, or 5 years away from you before you really have all that in place. That journey starts now, and it is worth it. It is worth it to say, what I'm in cannot continue. And I would argue that God, the Yahweh character is a psychopathic literary character, but when you're addicted to it and your family's addicted to it, and I like to say that when you think monstrous thoughts long enough, it kind of turns you into a monster. I'm sorry to say, but some of our loved ones around us have turned themselves voluntarily into monsters. And at a certain point, as much as we don't want to burn any bridges we don't have to, there is the reality that it is going to bite for a while, and you're going to have to make hard choices. But to say to yourself, I believe that this is worth it, and it's especially if you're protecting your friends or kids in this, but I believe it's worth it to leave toxicity for the sake of a better life, even though I know that this journey is going to be really dark for a while. And just to tell yourself, even though it's not going to feel like it, to tell yourself it will eventually get better. If you do the healing, you do the boundaries, and you get surround yourself with good people, it'll take time, but it will eventually get safe and better. And I just to say to anyone who's going through it, I know we're talking more theoretically because we're kind of stable on it where we've landed, but just like for anyone that's going through it, like I know this is for some of you very real. This is intense, and some of you are listening and you're like, you have no idea. You're talking about it as if like you have no idea how bad it is, and especially like the high controls, the JWs and stuff. Like I can't even talk to my parents anymore; they won't talk to me. I know it's real, and I'm so sorry for some of you are going through, and my heart goes out to you. And I wish better for us. I don't. Hitchens was once asked a question of like, if you could hit a button and end religion in the world, would you? Did you ever see that video? Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. You'd expect him to say, hell yes. You'd expect Christopher Hitchens to have said that, and ironically, he said no. But he was asked that question: if you could push a button and end religion immediately, would you do it? And I feel like in some ways, I'm not sure what I would answer to that today, but I do think we'll eventually, as a society move on long after I'm dead. And I hope that someday people look back at this stuff and say, this is as crazy as Thor and Zeus kind of stuff. And to end relationships over it is ridiculous. But, we're not there, and we won't be there. And it's just, we unfortunately have to deal with the cards we were given. And for some of us, it's going to be a rough journey. But I love how you said, the community aspect of it, even if you have to do it like through an anonymous profile, like get plugged into some kind of community, because the sooner you get people that will affirm you and love you through it, the better.
Yeah, I think that's super important, especially because Christianity is so demeaning to the self, right? The heart is deceitful and wicked, and the whole concept of original sin and all of that stuff. So we don't get a lot of affirmation. For a lot of people, they're traumatized at home, and then they go to church on Sundays and get beat up and traumatized more. And sometimes it just takes a lot of validation to help the person heal. And I love what you said about, encouraging yourself and speaking to yourself. It's not always going to be like this. It's going to be worth it. at the end, it's worth getting out of this toxic environment and toxic relationships. It's just really well said, very wise. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, speaking of wise words of wisdom, could you tell us about Phreology Friday and what you and Derek Day do? I apologize that I can also say I have not had the time and bandwidth to watch it. I've seen the invitations come up on a regular basis, and my life with 4 small kids is just way too busy to do much. But I do intend to watch it. But for any of us, including myself, who haven't plugged in yet, what is Phreology Friday? I assume that's an abbreviation for freed theology or free theology. But what does Phreology Friday stand for and mean? And what can we expect as we listen in?
Yeah, so I think Derek started Phreology Friday back before he had completely deconstructed and was a atheist. And he invited me to come along with him and be his co-host on that journey. So we talk about all kinds of stuff. We get together. We usually have a couple of drinks, and we talk about everything from religion to politics to current events to off-the-wall topics like Gnosticism and all kinds of stuff. So we just basically get together and have a good time. We don't think exactly alike, and so there are times that we're kind of going at it would be too strong of a word, but we're bantering back and forth various different ideas in a respectful manner. So we have a good time with it. A lot of the people that tune in regularly have a good time with it. Again, you can find that on YouTube. You can find it on my channel. You can find it on Derek's channel. You can find it on Facebook as well. And anybody's welcome to reach out and connect on Facebook. And yeah, that's 7 p.m. Eastern time. We do it every Friday.
That's so cool. I love it. I definitely want to watch you, and I want to hear what you all do. I'm sure it's amazing, especially with you all bantering, because we need some of that. In terms of just for today, is there anything else we didn't get to that you wanted to add on?
No, not that I can think of. I really appreciate Tim, you having me on and taking time to show interest in my story and listen to me, and I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope we can connect again sometime and keep the conversation going. Well, I'll just wrap up then by saying we've been speaking with Aaron Tomlinson. Please do like and subscribe and check out all the great work they're doing. But Aaron, thank you so much. Great to hear your story and great to get to know you. And I definitely want to do it again sometime.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Me too.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.